I'm going to try to explain national debt and trade deficit in a simple way that everyone can understand, even if you have never been to college or taken an economic class. The first thing you need to understand is that money for a government, any government, not just the US, is not the same as money for an individual or a company. The US government can print more money, but as an individual, I can't print more money. In this way, the US dollar kind of works like a casino poker chip. The US government, the owner of that said casino, controls how many poker chips are out there. In the real world, that would be how much US dollars are in circulation. We, the people, are both customers and employees in that said casino. Within that casino US, we are paid in poker chips. We can start our own business and pay someone else poker chips, and we can exchange those poker chips for service, products, and housing. The same way US dollars work in the real life. For us, that poker chip functions as money, but for the casino owner, the US government, they can always print more poker chip, aka the US dollar. There are some hoops to jump through before they can actually do that, but that is for another day. That is what most people fail to understand when they are talking about national debt, inflation, and trade deficit. People keep comparing national debt to your mortgage or your car loans. They are not the same. When a government owes someone, aka the national debt, it is similar to how the casino owner owes someone poker chip. The government, the casino US, in theory can print more poker chips to pay off that debt, but in practice they can't, because blindly increasing the poker chips, aka the US dollar, in circulation will cause inflation. Let me explain. Let's say there are three people, Alan, Bob, and Charlie, who all need food, but there are only two meals available. Alan has one poker chip, Bob has two, and Charlie has six. So there are nine chips in total in circulation. They all want to eat, so the meal are going to the highest bidder. The price of that meal will go up until one of them can't afford it. Alan with one chip is the poorest, can't afford it, so the price of that meal will be just beyond Alan's reach. So Bob and Charlie will each get a meal for two chips. But what if the casino owner, the US government, decides to intervene by printing two more chips and giving them to poor Alan? Now Bob, with two chips, will be the poorest who can't afford the meal. The price of that meal will increase to three, so Bob is the one who can't afford it. This is how blindly printing more US dollars and throwing them in circulation doesn't solve any problem but causes inflation. I'm sure by this point you have realized that there's a very simple solution, which is to just make one more meal. But in reality, it is a lot more complicated than that. First, you have to pay someone to make that extra meal, and that we are back into printing. Then we are back into printing more money, and then you have to also have to secure the resource to make that extra meal, and we are back into printing more money to buy that resource. In reality, there is also a more sinister scenario that you didn't think of. What if the rich guy Charlie wants both meals for himself? He offers three chips for each meal, and since both Alan and Bob can't afford to pay chips for the meal, they starve. Charlie with two meals may even throw away the second meal. In the real world, this happens a lot more often than you think, because the real life Alan and Bob are not the someone that you know, but someone in the other end of the world. The more you buy, the more the price goes up, and people don't always think about that there are people who make less than $10 a month on the other side of the world who may want to do the same thing, same material things as you do. This is how U.S. consumerism sometimes hurt people like Alan and Bob in some poor third world countries. The real life Charlie could have hundreds of chips and doesn't mind spending the extra four chips to get the better stuff. The real life Charlie doesn't even know there's an Alan and Bob out there across the globe who want to buy the same stuff but are too poor to buy it. Unknowingly, Alan and Bob can't afford it anymore because you drove up the price. In this case, it doesn't matter how many meals there are out there if Charlie is just going to buy them all. This shows money works more like a way to control the distribution of resources. I went off topic a little bit to inflation, but let's come back to the casino US. The key point of the previous analysis is that the casino US can't just print more chips without causing inflation. They need to make more meals. Then you can give Alan the extra one chip he needs to buy that meal. The meal price will stay at 2 chips. What if you don't print extra chip but still make that extra meal? Then you have the price of meal going down to 1 chip, and everyone can afford it. That is deflation. That is different kind of worms that I'm not about to touch today. For now, you only need to remember that deflation is even worse than inflation. So to stop the casino US from printing more chips that will cause inflation, there are safeguards in place, such as the Fed independence and the debt ceiling. When you do print more poker chips, aka the US dollar, you need to reduce the US dollars in circulation. This is done through treasury bonds and commonly known as national debt. That is why bonds or national debt exist. Now we are back on topic. When someone buys bond, their money is out of circulation while the government puts more money back into circulation. The government pays an interest on the bonds to encourage people to buy bonds, or for the people who buy those bonds, the interest makes it an investment. Now that we have established the basic concept of national debt, let's talk about the trade deficit. Because everything is connected and you cannot really understand everything if you don't know how they are connected to each other first. I'm sure with all those political talks on the news today, you know that US trade deficit means that the US buy more products from other countries than they buy from the US. In other words, products are flowing into the US while US dollars are flowing into the rest of the world. Now, coming back to my poker chips and casino metaphor, ask yourself, why would the rest of the world give US actual products like crude oil or aluminum in exchange for the US dollar poker chip when the US government can just print more poker chips? In theory, the rest of the world would accumulate more and more US dollar poker chip than they can spend through trade deficit. In theory, the value of the US dollar poker chip should drop with each trade deficit as they accumulate more than they can spend. Now look at the value of the US dollar, or the US dollar exchange rate. You will notice that the value of the US dollar exchange rate has mostly stayed the same. The reason for that is that the US dollar poker chip actually flow back into the US in some ways so that the rest of the world does not accumulate too many US dollar chips that would reduce its value. The US dollar obviously don't flow back into the US through regular import-export trade. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any trade deficit. So how does the rest of the world spend the US dollar they made through trade deficit while receiving so few US export? The answer is investment, mostly investment. Investment like bonds, stocks, private equities, and so on. And when foreign governments want to invest their US dollar but need extremely low rates, their US dollar will go to US bonds. This is how the foreign governments have accumulated so much in US bonds, aka the national debt. For example, China. For retail and institution investors, then money could also go to much riskier investments, such as angel investment. These investments through the US financial market is not just going into the US economy, it is also going into the world economy, because most US companies will do business with foreign countries. That is why the US has the biggest financial market in the world. Before that, the British Empire had the biggest financial market in the world when they were out there buying and plundering everything from other countries in the world. They had a big trade deficit with China too. So as long as the US financial market is attractive enough to the global investor to bring back the US dollars, the value of the US dollar will stay put and everything is fine. As long as there is a balance, money keeps flowing from US to foreign countries, then into the financial market, products will flow from foreign countries into the US, and then US dollar flow back into the US through the financial market. This is how you have the bull market. Bond yields are stable, the dollar exchange rate is stable, and the trade deficit is not that big of a deal that some politicians want you to believe. This is how the economy works. It is same for every other country. Everything is linked, and if you break one, you break them all. Trade deficit is simply one link of many in this economy. It is neither good or bad. For example, if you break the trade deficit, then the rest of the world doesn't get the US dollar that they used to. The value of the US dollar exchange rate rises, and their own currency exchange rate will drop. To maintain the value of their own currency, they will have to sell their investment in the US and bring that US dollar back to maintain a stable currency exchange rate. The US financial market will drop because of the outflow of the investment. The financial market loses value and become less attractive, and more money will flow out of the US financial market, causing more crashes. This is how you get a bear market. There are some examples of this kind of economic disasters. For example, North Korea also need to buy a lot of stuff from other countries. Usually that will cause a trade deficit. But because they are not attractive at all for foreign investment, their casino cheap currency cannot flow back into their own country if they ever flow out. And the value of their currency drops so much that they are essentially worthless. This establishes a new balance in which North Korea cannot import anything using its own currency. They have to use the US dollar, even if they think the US is the enemy. The market always finds a balance. A lot of countries in the world also have similar problem, but not to the same extent. They also need to use US dollars instead of their own currency to import foreign products. In fact, 90% of the global foreign transactions are done using US dollars, even if in most cases the USA is never part of that trade. That is essentially the US dollar dominance. Some countries like China try to get around that by limiting how US dollar and their own currency get in and out of their own country. That is how you have currency manipulation. That is something that US politicians should have done something about. So when we are talking about the US trade deficit, the US is actually exchanging useless poker chips for actual products. And the only reason they let the US do that is because the US economy is stable, and that's very attractive to the global investors. Cutting off the US from the rest of the world by eliminating the trade deficit is going to damage the economy. Not to mention, a lot of products are simply unavailable in the US. For example, you have to get coffee, rubber, banana, and chocolate through import because the US simply don't have the climate to grow those things. Now let's talk about the bond yield. Part of the link that I mentioned earlier that keeps everything working the way it should in the economy. This is where the national debt comes back out to play. Compared to the trade deficit, the national debt is something that poses a real threat to the US economy. As I mentioned before, bond is part of that investment that gets US dollar flowing back into the US. If the bond market crashes, the foreign governments who invest in the US mostly in bonds will lose money. Eventually, bonds are less attractive to the foreign investors, and the financial market will crash. The flow of the US dollar back into the US slows down, and the value of the US dollar drops. The foreign investment in the US lose value due to loss of value in the US currency. The purchasing power of the US dollar drop, and the US has less power to buy from other countries. In this case, the import will drop and trade deficits are reduced in a bad way. Usually, this doesn't happen all of a sudden, unless you have a national debt default. This happened to the Greek government once when they couldn't pay their national debt, aka a default on their debt. This also happened quite recently when the UK's 46-day Prime Minister Liz Truss decided to overspend. In the case of the UK, when you overspend, you take on a lot more debt, And if the investors don't think you will be able to pay back the debt, your debt, aka the bond market, crashes. Those investors are often called bond vigilantes. They see a weakness in your bond and they rush in to make money by selling your debt. Both cases caused major market crashes, and if the US government can't pay its national debt, or if the investors simply don't believe you can pay your national debt, this would happen to the US too. That is why the national debt is a very serious issue. You reduce that debt in three ways. Reduce government spending by cutting the budget, increasing income through more taxes, or have an economy that grows faster than the national debt. Whether that is being done right now by Washington is something you need to find out on your own. The thing is, you need to keep in mind, as I said earlier, national debt exists for a reason. There's nothing wrong with having a national debt. What is dangerous is not being able to pay that debt on time. That is why earlier I had to emphasize that the national debt is not the same as your mortgage or your car loan. When talking about national debt, what doesn't matter as much is who the US government owes their national debt to. Because no matter how much the US government owes to certain countries in bond, no country can force the US government to pay that debt in advance. This has nothing to do with military strength. This simply has no legal ground to push the US to pay in advance. The US has no legal or moral obligation to pay in advance either. And there is nothing to gain by paying that in advance either. What a hostile foreign government can do is to sell the bond to crash the bond market. But as I have mentioned before, a crashed bond market will drag down the entire financial market of the US. And because the US financial market is intertwined into the global economy, US financial crashes will drag down the whole global market as we have seen recently. The US dollar and the investments using the US dollars owned by that foreign government will also lose values. So everyone will take a hit, not just the US. Such action will hurt both the US and the hostile foreign government. So in conclusion, in conclusion, the trade deficit is neither good nor bad. National debt exists for a reason. Not being able to pay that national debt on time is a big threat. I hope you learned something today, so I didn't waste my time for nothing.